So, even if you know about material design guideline and how to solve issues in coding, pitching on accessibility improvement will not be as easy as an new shiny feature. Like just changing the size of a button and all of a sudden it becomes a requirement change that will have an implementation cost and a priority. And because most people don't understand the importance of accessibility, your request is very likely to get postponed, if even considered at all. I know the feel. I went through that too. And today I would like to share with you what I learned from that experience so that hopefully, if you ever face the same challenge, you will have all the information that you need. Because even as a developer, you too can help change things. And so my name is Tiphaine, and that's the French for Tiffany. I'm an Android engineer living in Japan, and I work for MedPeer, which is a company in the medical industry. And I mainly focus on an application called Kakari, which is used to avoid waiting times at pharmacies by sending your prescription in advance. And I'm also on Twitter, so feel free to follow me. So I have many things I want to talk about today, so let's get started. First of all, why is accessibility not considered at work? Like, why is it so hard to even talk about it? There are mainly four reasons for that. First, companies started on the wrong foot. Like many companies get introduced to accessibility by bad reviews or complaints about their app, or worst case by lawsuits. And due to this bad first impression, they get annoyed when you try to talk about going further the basic minimum. And they don't know how to deal with the problem. Like accessibility is often seen as a noun requirement, something complicated or vague that seems overwhelming, so they tend to postpone dealing with the issue. And the risk of doing nothing is not clear for business leadership. And people are already busy, so they don't want more work. So today I will address all these issues so you are ready to face them. And first, let's get rid of those two add-ons. For that, we can use this Chinese saying, if you know your enemy and know yourself, in 100 battles, you will never be defeated. People get annoyed about accessibility because they don't understand much about it, and they don't know from where the attacks will come from. And they see accessibility as something overwhelming because they don't know they have weapons ready for them to use. So what kind of problems can you expect and how can you deal with it? So the disabilities that might influence a user's experience with a mobile app can be classified in four categories: visual, motor, cognitive, and auditory. So any problem related to accessibility will come from either one of those. And visual problems include not understanding where an error is inside a form. For example, colorblind people will see red as green. And also not being able to read text depending on the font size or the font color. And not understanding anything about the app if the person cannot see at all. Then you have users with motor disabilities that will have trouble clicking small button, and difficulties with some gestures like swipe or drag and drop. Or they might not be able to interact with your app at all if they cannot use the touch screen. And then the range of issues related to cognitive disabilities is very broad. But for example, people with ADHD have troubles focusing, so they won't be able to read long text. And people with dyslexia might see words reversed or mixed up, so they have troubles comprehending what they read. And people with low digital literacy might not understand what we consider common knowledge. So, for example, the meaning of the icons for saving or sharing might not be obvious for them. And for auditory problems, some people will have difficulties understanding if a voice is too high or speaks too fast. And if the person cannot perceive sound, they will miss important information. And they won't be able to understand the content of a video without subtitles. So to make sure that anyone can use a smartphone despite all these problems, assistive technologies have been developed. And you can find many different ones depending on disability. But for example, people with visual disabilities can change the font size of their phone or use color correction if they are colorblind. And if they cannot see at all, they can use screen readers like TalkBack that will translate the content of the screen in a way that they can understand. And if a user has motor disabilities, they can change their display size to enlarge everything on screen and also use their voice to navigate their phone. And there is also this switch access that allows people to interact with their phone by using a device like on the picture with one or two buttons. And there are many, many more other assistive technologies for all types of disabilities. So you might be thinking, I will never remember all of that. But fear not, I have good news for you. You don't need to remember all of that. Because many people worked hard on the topic and they created a guideline that we can use. And just by following that guideline, all problems will be solved and you will even be able to support all assistive technologies. How cool is that? And that super guideline is called WCAG, which is the short for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And it was made by an organization called W3C. And if you're not familiar with them, they're the ones who created and still create global web standards. So basically, they make international rules that to ensure that anyone can use the internet wherever they are in the world. And the famous example would be that, like, they are behind HTTP, the set of rules for transferring files over the web. And I know the name might be confusing, but this guideline is also used for mobile applications. And the content is just a list of requirements that you need to follow. And those requirements are divided in 4 principles. So you have perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Robust meaning that the content is robust enough to be interpreted by any assistive technologies. And each requirement is also assigned a level of conformance. So the first one, single A, is the minimum. Like any app below that level won't be usable, even if you have assistive technology. And then you have double A, which is the ideal level you want to aim for, because if you stop at the previous one, some users will still be excluded. And finally, you have AAA, if you are cool enough to reach that. And this one is more about improving the usability of your app. And WCAG is famous for being a bit hard to read, especially if you don't have a background in web development. But don't worry, you are not alone. Many companies have published their own mobile accessibility guidelines based on WCAG. So they even include code samples. So you will have all the information to get the work done. All right, next problem. We want the people above us to understand the merits and the risks for business in their decisions. Like, why do they even need to care about accessibility? Well, of course, because that's the right thing to do, but you cannot teach people to care about people. However, they definitely want to have a good image for their company, and even small actions will make your company look good, so that's good for marketing. And besides, accessibility is a growing industry trend. Like companies such as Twitter or Facebook or Microsoft keep on pushing it. And that means that your users are becoming familiar with the topic. And as they get used to accessibility features such as dark mode, they will expect your product to provide them as well. And if you have any rival, that's your chance to stand out. Like just check out what your competition is doing about accessibility. If they haven't done much yet, you can invest on it first and differentiate yourself from them. And if they already started anything, you definitely want to catch up with them. Because if you manage to improve your product accessibility before or in a better way than them, you will attract loyal customers. If your app is accessible, you will make people feel included, so they will support your product. And this way, you don't only reach disabled people. A happy customer will share their experience with their family and friends, so you can expect to broaden your reach to many, many more people. And on the contrary, if a customer had a bad experience, they will also tell the people around them, right? And with internet nowadays, if they post that on social media, your company might face a huge negative publicity. And did you know that accessibility can also improve your code quality? You will need to have a guideline for your accessibility efforts, and having a guideline will help you write cleaner code. And we all love clean code. And since you will need to do the same things in multiple places, I believe you will abstract it and make reusable components, right? And having reusable components will make it easier to implement new functionalities. And finally, accessibility will encourage the implementation of UI tests, which will help for the maintenance of the app in general too. And this is a point that people often misunderstand. The goal of accessibility is slightly different than usability. With accessibility, you aim to reduce the number of people who cannot use your app. And with usability, you aim to improve the user's opinion about your app. So basically, by improving accessibility, you increase the number of users that you have not reached yet. And by improving usability, you make your users stay and happy. So for a business, both are important, but especially the part about reaching people that are not yet your users. In a world where the global population is aging, you definitely want to care about it. Like the proportion of older people is projected to increase everywhere. And this chart shows you the median age for a population, which means that there are as many older and as many younger people than this midpoint in a time. And I just picked a few examples, but as you can see, the median age is increasing everywhere. And if you need more numbers, in 2050, 1 in 6 person in the world will be over 65. So those people are currently in their late 30s, which means that when they get old, these seniors will be very different from what we know. They will all be heavy smartphone users. Every day as I speak, these people are looking up information on the net, they chat with their friends, they do shopping, or even work with their phone. And eventually they will age. But when their vision decreases and when their hands start shaking, they will not just stop using all the applications they like, right? So your current users will age and their needs will change. But on top of that, many countries will also see their population size decrease. So if your application is only targeting one market, your user base will shrink as well. And you might have no choice but to try the expanding market of older users, who are, by the way, going to live longer. And anyone over 40 can tell you that your body will start to change much earlier than you expect. So the potential users that you could reach by accommodating aging troubles is much bigger than the official numbers. And just like you cannot see the real impact of the population growing old from the official numbers, you also cannot rely on numbers related to disabled people. And the reason lies in the survivor bias. So this is a common logical error where people who pass the selection process will overlook those who did not. And by only focusing on the survivors, we draw incorrect conclusions about what happened. So on the accessibility topic, it will look something like this. You don't improve the accessibility of your app, so disabled people are unable to use the product and they don't appear in your user stats. And we keep on having this low awareness in society about them. So they are seen as a minority and you think, okay, there's no need to consider them. And you keep on not improving the accessibility of your app. So because disabled people don't even have the possibility to use the app, or that they don't know it is possible, the numbers will never tell you about them. And there are also more reasons why you cannot rely on numbers. Because of the low awareness of accessibility in general, people end up thinking that there are not disabled people around them, while in fact there are a lot of disabilities that are not visible. So someone you've known for a long time might actually have a disability and you just don't know about it. And besides, people might not even be aware that they have disabilities, or they might not be able to admit it. Like, for example, most people who wear glasses or contacts are not aware that they are considered disabled visually. And people with cognitive disabilities like dyslexia or depression will tend to hide their disabilities because of society's pressure or expectations. And people with temporary injury usually won't admit that they are disabled, and they will refuse to use assistive technology. And more importantly, the target of accessibility is way more larger than the population defined in the government states. Because the target is not just disabled people, it's everyone. And thanks to accessibility improvements such as subtitles or voice control or the vibration for push notifications, the experience for all users will improve. And actually, anyone can get temporary or situational disabilities. Like, for example, if you forgot your earphones, you might not be able to understand the content of a video, and that's a situational auditory disability. And this is something my boss used to say all the time. Don't assume anything. Like, you cannot make any assumption about people's capabilities, what they think, what value they will find in your app, and how they will use your app. Like, for example, did you know that blind people also use fitness app and that deaf people also enjoy music? Like, we just cannot imagine how other people interact with the world. And accounting for accessibility will also help you create a better product because having constraints is how you drive innovation. Uh, Creative ideas comes from having limits. And in an environment with constraints, your imagination and your skills will improve, and better skills will ensure a higher product quality. And on the contrary, if you refuse to have a constraint and think outside the box, you won't improve at all, and that will become a problem because bad designs disable people. Anyone can get temporarily disabled because of bad design. Like, for example, when a button is too small and it takes you a few tries to be able to tap it, that's exactly what's happening. And if your product is not accessible, you can get sued for that. Because if you are excluding disabled people, that's discrimination. And this is the numbers of digital accessibility lawsuits in America in the past years. And as you can see, it almost doubled to reach more than 4,000 cases last year. And if you think you're all right because your product is not available in the US, then I have bad news for you. Because most countries have digital accessibility laws, and in most cases, they also apply to private sector. So this is the list that you can find on W3C website, and apparently it's not up to date because I found that some countries like Brazil should also be on the list. So even if your country is not on the list, you might still want to check with your local legislation. And digital accessibility laws also apply.
Seems like we have some brief technical difficulties. I just messaged. Yeah, all right, cool. This can be edited out though, so that's an easy solution.
All right, so I'll keep on from here. And so digital accessibility law also applies to mobile apps. And in fact, many cases are about mobile apps. So you might have heard of the famous case for Domino Pizza. That one was in fact about a user who could not order a pizza with the mobile app. So if you don't want legal problems, your company will need to improve their product accessibility. And now time for the last boss. So I will explain how you can bring accessibility in the development process without drowning other people in work. But first, let's talk about the reason why people think that accessibility will increase their workload. So there are variations around, but roughly this is the framework that we use when developing an application. So you basically divide the life cycle in phases like planning, design, implementation, testing, and maintenance. And by using this framework, if you were to check for accessibility only in the later phases like testing, when you eventually catch something, you will need to change your design or your code, right? And that means going all the way back to the beginning of the cycle, increasing the production cost of your current iteration. But if you actually introduce very simple checks for each phases, you would catch most problems right at the start. And by checks, I mean a very basic checklist for each specialty. So you would have one specialized for the PM, for designers, for engineers, for QA, only focusing in their area of expertise so that the final result of each checklist would be very short. And that way, the cost of developing an accessible app will not be as horrifying as people seem to imagine. So let's see what you can do to reach that goal. But first of all, before trying anything, and this is not limited to accessibility, you need to observe your surroundings to better understand your current situation. And during that period of observation, you will be looking to answer these questions, like how much attention is paid to accessibility in your current company? What's the general atmosphere around this issue? So for my part, I wrote like a couple issues on it, and I watched how people reacted. And what is the current state of your app? Maybe it's already accessible. And you can check that with Google's Accessibility Scanner app or the Prudential report on Play Console. And who are the decisions maker? Yes, I'm talking about getting a basic understanding of your workplace politics and relationships, because the person with the most influence is not always the highest in the hierarchy. Who are your allies? Like maybe there are people in your current company that care about accessibility and maybe they are advocating for it. So if such effort already exists and you are very lucky, you definitely want to know who is involved. And on the contrary, you also want to understand who is likely to push back, like what their motivation is. So now that we have a good grasp of your current situation, the next step is to study about accessibility. And what you need to study will depend on your situation and your current allies, but the goal is to get a deeper understanding of accessibility, like why a business needs to work on it, how far you want to go, and how you can actually improve your application. So I recommend to at least learn about the basics, the importance of accessibility, and try to read WCAG. So in my case, because I only have a very basic understanding of web development, I never managed to read WCAG by myself. But luckily for me, one of my allies is a front-end engineer. So we organized a WCAG study session for like 30 minutes per week. And with all this information, you are ready to decide on your goal and make a plan. I recommend setting achievable incremental goals, like don't aim for the moon. You want realistic goals to aim for, because the closer you get to them, the more motivated you will be to continue running. And you also need enough time to achieve them. So you want to think in periods like half a year or 1 year. And if you will then need to identify the problems in your app and create tickets. So ideally at this point, you would want to have an accessibility expert look at your app. But if you don't have that kind of budget, don't worry, you can use tools as well. And in my case, since we were reading WCAG, I looked at the app at the same time and I took note of the issues. And finally, you will have to prioritize those tickets and please complete them as well. So the priority can be decided by asking yourself how much value this change would bring to the users and how big the implementation cost would be. And please note that the implementation cost is highly influenced by your designer and your own skill level, so you will need to discuss about it. And your team will probably not stop developing new features just to focus on accessibility. Plus, it's very difficult to get buy-in for big changes. And more importantly, if you keep on hitting walls of resistance, that's the fastest way to a burnout. So the key is to think on the long term. Do what you can within your reach, little by little, but continuously. So I suggest that you divide your tickets in small tasks and that you start with the smallest and easiest ones. So for example, you can improve one screen at a time or just like one view. Like this is because you want the satisfaction of completing the tasks. You want to see them crossed out of your to-do list because that will increase your motivation to go further. And you don't want to scare your team with like a bunch of tickets all of a sudden, or they might just reject everything. So go gradually. For example, one ticket per sprint. And besides, having accessibility tickets coming up regularly in discussions is the best way to make your team slowly get used to the topic. And definitely do not try to bring huge changes all at once. Instead, things will be way smoother if you integrate small checks into existing processes. So for example, if you have a peer template, you can add an accessibility reminder or checklist inside. And if you have automated tests, you can also add a few checks there too. And for this point, ask your colleagues for ideas. Like they might be more creative or they might have information you don't know. And plus, people will be more supportive if their ideas gets implemented, and you want people to feel part of the project. And the next step is actually implementing something and releasing it. And the result will be very different depending on the situation. So here is what happened for me. So we decided to, for a long-term goal, to aim for compliance to WCAG single A, and first focus on the perceivable criteria to hopefully meet them by the end of September. And my very supportive leader agreed to let me focus full-time on this project for a month, which was super cool. But it was a bad timing to ask for design changes, so I was only able to do TalkBack support. However, I did manage to do all the screens of one of our apps and have that released just on time. And that might not sound a lot, but it was a lot. And yes, the app is only in Japanese. I'm sorry. This is an app that you use to make appointments, chats, or video calls with your family doctor. And the result is not perfect, but at least it should be accessible. So cool, you finally released something. Congratulations. You might think your job is done, but remember, we are thinking on the long term, you still have a few things to do. So after each release, don't forget to update your checklist so that new functionalities don't bring back issues that you already solved. And you should also share with your colleagues what you learned and any information that will be useful for maintenance. So in my case, I gave an online internal training on accessibility that anyone could attend, where I explain the basics in details and how to use TalkBack. And I also provided support for the people who did the manual testing with TalkBack. An internal guideline will be the documentation you leave behind so that other departments can use it when they're ready to focus on accessibility. And if you have the support of someone high in the hierarchy and you are very lucky, you can ask them to put something about accessibility in the company's value or policies. So it gets easier for you to have people listen to you in the future. And you will also want to write an accessibility statement of for your app. So this is usually a web page similar to the one you provide regarding privacy policy, but this one is about accessibility. And this is where you would explain your current situation regarding WCAG, acknowledge issues or non-limitations, and also provide a way of contact for disabled people to report any problem. And if you manage to have your app pass a WCAG compliance audit and you got a certification, that's also where you would want to display it. And depending on where your app is available, you might also have to write a clause about the local legislation. And by the way, an accessibility statement is mandatory in Europe. You definitely want to keep track of your progress, but you should avoid using tracking the use of assistive technology. Mainly because that data is related to the user's health, which is protected by privacy law. But also because that data is not reliable. Like remember the survivor bias. People who actually need that tool might not be using it. And anyway, there are other ways to track your progress. Like for example, the number of WCAG requirements that you met, the situation with the goals that you set previously, And if you have a lot of small tickets, like how many you got done so far. And you can also have a look at the number of inquiries related to accessibility. Like, do you have any inquiry or requests from people who use assistive technologies? Or do you have less complaints about accessibility? Like, all those are informations that you could use. And regarding relationships at work, here are a few advices that I humbly offer. People who push back are not rejecting you personally. Like, everyone is just busy with their lives and sometimes not ready to listen to you. So if someone refuses to listen to you, like, just compromise and think on the long term. And of course, if you keep on dealing with such people, like, on the long term, it will get tough. So you will want to increase your allies. And the best way for that is to build a welcoming atmosphere, encourage and recognize people's contributions. So for example, if you notice during a PR review that someone wrote a code that complies with the accessibility guideline, make sure to praise them for that. Don't put unnecessary pressure on yourself. You are not an accessibility specialist. You are a developer who wants to make things better. And even really stubborn people will be more open to listen if the conversation comes from someone they trust or someone above them. So if you can, try to get support from people with such influence. Final step. Make sure to communicate internally on progress. People usually don't know much about accessibility, but if you provide information in a way that's easy to understand and digest, most people will get interested to some degree. And what's the point of improving your app's accessibility if your customers don't know about it? And since this is also good for your company's branding, you can do that with a press release. Also get feedbacks on what you implemented. So if you have the budget, you can organize usability tests where you would have disabled people trying your app. And ideally, you would want to have disabled people in your team. But if that seems a very far future from your situation, don't worry too much. Because actually, even with small acts in your daily lives, you can contribute to raising accessibility awareness. Like just sharing information on SNS or just talking about it with your friends, that already helps a lot. And if you post photos on Twitter, you can write a single line of alt text. That would be a huge contribution to improve things. Because not only will you make disabled people feel more included, seeing a post like that might be how someone gets to know about accessibility. So you might inspire someone to change, or you might make the day of someone who is trying to promote accessibility at their work. And these are the main references are used when making these slides, and half of them are in Japanese, I'm sorry, but I highly recommend the two in English. And that's all for today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for that. I think we're going to give another minute for folks to post questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, we have one question.
We do.
Feels weird when it's my question.
Yeah, but it's a pretty good question actually. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Are there probably so yes, there are. And as I say, it's not a good idea, but yes, there are. But if you want to do that, you might want, like I saw, for example, Discord, they will display a dialogue to ask, are you okay with us knowing that you use TalkBack? Like if you open Discord with TalkBack on it, it will ask you your permission. So yes, there are ways to know about that
Awesome.
automatically.
Just to make sure like people hear the question, because I'm not sure they will be see, I'll just like repeat it. Yeah. Are there pragmatic ways to identify when users use an accessibility feature so that there is data about which options are most impactful to support? Yeah. Yeah, and thanks for answering, and thanks for insightful talk. Yeah, this, in my opinion, was really interesting and useful, definitely.
We got some answers in the chat as well about that. I see.
I get the feeling, instead of the Q&A part here, it's going to be a lot more fun in the tables with Robert.
Yeah, he has a lot of things to say, it seems. I'm reading at the same time, which is nice.
Okay, then I guess we're good to go. Closing up Andrew Worldwide for the night. I guess we'll see each other at the tables and then we'll go our merry ways. Thank you everybody for joining. Pavlo, thank you for speaking and being a host today. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, I everybody, love you all. See you in a second, but it's been a wonderful day.
Stay tuned. We'll come back in around 3 months, right?
It's very true. In the new year, we'll be reborn.
Yep. In a new format, which we haven't finalized yet, but expect something interesting.
Big changes coming your way. January 2023. Okay. See you guys. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.